Okay, so let's dive in. Have you ever just paused and thought about how you think?
Hmm.
Not what you think, but, the actual process. Taking information in, making sense of it, deciding what's what.
Yeah, that whole machinery behind belief and decision making.
Exactly. We call it reasoning or critical thinking. But here's the interesting bit, even for the experts. Pinning down exactly what that is, it's been surprisingly tough.
Oh, absolutely. And the definitions have really shifted over time.
Right. Different fields emphasize different things. What seems clear one minute is debate at the next.
It's a constantly evolving picture.
And that's really the heart of our deep dive today. We've pulled together some sources that, well, they really showcase this complexity.
We're looking at a pretty wide range.
Yeah, from a 1930 psychology paper kind of grappling with definitions to a key paper on critical thinking from the 60s, and then right up to recent work on verbal reasoning, especially, in higher education.
And the goal isn't just to summarize these. It's to pull out the really key insights, the surprises, the useful bits that help you, our listener, understand these processes better.
How do you know if an argument holds water? How do you spot the weaknesses? How does this abstract stuff actually play out when you're reading or learning? That's what we want to unpack.
Exactly. So let's dig into these different perspectives, see where the experts clashed, where they agreed, and what it means for navigating things today.
Sounds good. Where should we start? Maybe with the basics. What even is reasoning?
Let's do that. Because that's precisely the challenge highlighted in one of our earliest sources, that 1930 paper by E.B. Skaggs. He starts right off expressing his uneasiness and discontent.
Uneasiness and discontent in 1930 about defining reasoning.
Yep, because the writers and textbooks back then just couldn't seem to agree on a definition.
Wow, that feels, well, very familiar even now. So, what were the main camps, according to Skaggs? How were they trying to define it?
He basically saw two main approaches. First, what he called the process definition.
Okay, process definition.
This way tries to pinpoint some unique feature inside the thought process itself. Skaggs mentions William James, for instance.
Oh, William James.
Yeah. James saw reasoning as the ability to deal with novel data. He talked about analysis, abstraction, finding similarities to old experiences, sort of a specific mental move.
So, breaking things down, seeing connections, applying old knowledge in a new way. That's the process.
Essentially, yes. Substituting parts and their implications for the whole situation. Focus on the internal mechanics of figuring out something new.
Okay, I think I get that. What was the other main approach Skaggs found?
The second was the end result definition.
End result. Makes sense.
This view was a bit more skeptical about finding one single unique process. Instead, they defined reasoning by the outcome.
The outcome.
Yeah, and the attitude you take towards it. Skaggs cites W.B. Pillsbury here, who suggested reasoning leads to something new and are accepted as true.
Oh, so it's less about how the gears turned inside your head and more about ending up with a new conclusion that you actually believe is correct.
Exactly. The focus shifts from the internal journey to the destination, a novel belief you accept.
So, process versus end result. Did Skaggs pick a side or try to merge them?
He tried to find a middle ground, aiming to resolve this tension. He proposed his own definition.
Okay, what was it?
He said, reasoning is a process which may occur at any point in a thought movement and consists in the appreciation of likenesses and differences between old experiences and a new situation.
Likenesses and differences. That feels key. Not just seeing how things are similar.
Right. He specifically emphasized appreciating the differences, giving credit to others like Shepard and Vogelsonger for that insight. It's not just pattern matching the similarities.
You also need to see how this new thing is unique.
Precisely. And Skaggs saw that moment of appreciating both as a kind of insight, a sudden grasp of the situation.
That makes a lot of sense. That aha moment often involves seeing both the connection and the distinction. But Skaggs also mentioned a big problem, right? How do you know someone's reasoning?
Exactly. That was a huge part of his discontent, especially with, say, animals or infants. You can't see inside their heads. How do you distinguish real reasoning from just, trial and error or instinct or habit?
Right. How do you get objective proof?
Well, when action is involved, he suggested looking for outward signs. He drew on observations of apes solving problems.
Okay, look, what signs?
He proposed three key things to look for. First, an inhibition of random movement, basically, stopping the flailing around.
A pause.
Yeah, a pause. Then hesitation, suggesting consideration. And then finally, a direct execution of the proper movements to solve the problem.
The pause, the hesitation, then the targeted action. That does feel like a plausible sign of something more than reflex going on.
It gives you something observable, at least, something concrete to point to for that internal process we can't directly see.
Okay. Now, stepping slightly away from just Skaggs, another source brings up a useful distinction, right? Between reasoning and argument.
Yes, that's a really helpful clarification.
Hmm.
People often use them interchangeably.
I probably do. What's the difference?
Well, the source explains that argument is mainly a social verbal thing. It happens between people, usually to persuade or resolve a disagreement.
Okay, like a debate or discussion.
Right. Whereas reasoning is described as the more abstract internal process of drawing inferences. It's the thinking behind the argument.
Ah, so reasoning is what you do inside your head to figure out your position.
An argument is how you present that reasoning to others to make your case.
Got it. The Source puts it nicely, doesn't it? Something like.
Yeah, reasoning is what you may do before you argue. And your argument expresses some of your best reasoning.
Okay, that clears things up. Reasoning powers the argument.
Exactly. And just briefly, the sources also touch on different kinds of reasoning.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, there's theoretical reasoning, trying to figure out what's true based on evidence,
Mm-hmm.
versus practical reasoning, which is more about figuring out how to achieve a goal, linking actions to aims.
Truth-seeking versus goal-seeking. Makes sense.
And then you have things like deductive reasoning, where the conclusion has to be true if the premises are true.
Like in formal logic.
Right. And verbal reasoning, which is tightly linked to skills like critical reading, understanding not just the words, but the implications, the assumptions, going beyond the text. There are other distinctions too, like static versus dynamic premises, but those are the main flavors.
Okay, so clearly, just defining reasoning is already pretty complex and has a long history of debate. Let's build on that. How does this connect to critical thinking? That feels like reasoning with a purpose, maybe.
That's a great way to put it. It's like applying reasoning with a specific focus on evaluation. And for this, we can turn to Robert H. Ennis and his really influential 1964 paper.
Ennis, 1964. Okay. What was his take?
He offered a core definition that sounds simple, but packs a punch.
Mm-hmm.
Critical thinking is the correct assessing of statements.
Correct assessing of statements. Okay, sounds straightforward. But I bet the devil's in the details of correct and assessing.
You got it. Ennis makes it clear that doing this correctly means navigating a whole bunch of potential pitfalls. It involves making many different kinds of judgments to evaluate claims properly.
So what are some of those key judgments? We probably can't cover everything he listed.
No, it's a detailed list, but we can hit the highlights. A really fundamental one is judging the logic. Does the statement actually follow from the reasons given?
Like, is the argument valid?
Exactly. This includes formal deductive logic, but Ennis points out that a lot of real-world reasoning uses what he calls open-textured principles or generalizations, things that are generally true but might have exceptions.
Ah, like that economics example you mentioned earlier, about supply, demand, and price.
Precisely. If supply is constant and demand decreases, price decreases. Generally true, but maybe not if there's government price control, or depending on the specific sector. Critical thinking here involves judging if the conclusion probably follows, or if the principle even applies in this specific case.
So dealing with uncertainty and context.
Yes. And closely related is judging assumptions. Arguments often leave things unsaid.
Right, the hidden premises, like the microscope example. Demand drops, so the price will drop.
Perfect example. The assumption might be a general economic principle. Judging it means asking, is that assumption warranted here? Does it fit microscopes right now? Is it the simplest explanation? Does it align with what experts know?
So you're constantly evaluating not just what's said, but what's implied.
Crucially. Then, moving beyond the argument structure, you need to judge the information itself, like judging observation statement reliability.
How trustworthy is the raw data or the eyewitness account?
Exactly. Ennis borrows criteria from fields like law and history. How close was the observer? Do other sources confirm it? Was the source biased? Are the records reliable made at the time by the person involved? Believed correct then?
Assessing the quality of the evidence at its source. What about bigger claims based on that evidence?
That leads to judging whether a simple generalization is warranted. Like the example about red-headed people tend to have hot tempers.
Okay, how do you judge that critically?
Well, it's not just about counting examples. You need to look at the quality and variety of reliable instances. More examples are needed if the population is very diverse. Critically, how was the sample chosen? Was it biased? Are there significant counterexamples?
Avoiding hasty generalizations based on skewed data.
Right. And then we get to more complex things, judging whether a hypothesis is warranted, or even a whole theory.
These are things that explain data, not just summarize it.
Exactly. Like the hypothesis that the archaeological site Hisarlik is ancient Troy, or a scientific hypothesis about how pressure works in liquids.
How do you assess those? It feels more complicated.
It is. Key criteria include: does it actually explain a good amount and variety of reliable data? Does it fit with broader accepted knowledge systems? Crucially, is it inconsistent with any solid evidence? And importantly, are competing hypotheses inconsistent with the evidence? That last one is the foundation of controlled experiments.
Trying to rule out the alternatives.
Yes. And another big one is the hypothesis testable. Can you even imagine what kind of evidence would support it or refute it?
Testable in principle, you mean? Not necessarily that we can do the test right now.
Precisely. You could, in theory, swim down with gauges to test the pressure hypothesis, even if it's difficult. But a hypothesis like gremlins cause plane crashes, well, how would you even begin to test that in a way that could potentially prove it wrong?
Right. If you can't even imagine evidence against it, it's not really a scientific hypothesis.
Correct. And Ennis notes that judging full-blown theories is even more complex. Similar criteria apply, but you also consider things like simplicity.
Ah, Occam's razor. Prefer the simpler explanation.
Kind of, like preferring the Copernican sun-centered model over the incredibly complex Ptolemaic earth-centered one because it was simpler and explained things more elegantly. Also, with theories, contrary evidence often leads to adjustments or adding auxiliary assumptions rather than outright rejection, at least for a while.
Until it becomes too patched up and a better alternative comes along.
Exactly. So, we've judged logic, assumptions, observations, generalizations, hypotheses, theories. What else is crucial for assessing statements?
Seems like we've covered the core reasoning and evidence parts.
We also need to judge the language being used. That includes judging ambiguity.
Ah, when words shift, meaning mid-argument.
Yes. The example given is about chlorinating water. Someone might argue it violates religious principles against medication, but they might be sliding between a broad sense of medication preventing disease and a narrow one, treating a specific person's illness.
That happens all the time in debates. Slippery words.
Definitely. And also, judging over vague or over-specific statements. This isn't about whether the statement is true, but whether it's useful for the specific situation or purpose.
Like, is it precise enough or too detailed?
Right. You're saying education has disappeared from the schools. Useful.
Yeah.
Probably too vague if you need to make curriculum recommendations. But maybe it's specific enough if you're giving a stark report to a leader about total system collapse in a war zone. It depends on the goal.
Context and purpose determine the right level of detail. Okay. One more big area. We rely on experts a lot.
We do. So judging alleged authority reliability is key. You can't be an expert in everything. How do you judge if an expert's claim is likely warranted?
What are the signs?
Ennis lists criteria like, does the person have a good reputation in that specific field? Is the statement actually within their area of expertise? Are they relatively disinterested? Or do they stand to gain personally? Did they seem to follow accepted methods in reaching their conclusion? Are they aware their reputation is on the line?
That's a solid checklist for evaluating expert claims. So Ennis gives us this really comprehensive framework for the correct assessing of statements. Did he also say what isn't critical thinking, in his view?
Yes, he was quite specific. He deliberately excluded judging value statements. Things like, this is good, or that action is wrong.
So, focused on descriptive or factual claims, not moral or aesthetic ones.
Correct. And he also excluded most aspects of simply identifying a problem. His focus was squarely on the cognitive act of assessing whether a statement about the world is likely true or warranted based on the evidence and reasoning presented.
Got it. So it's a rigorous evaluation of claims about how things are. Now, how does all this connect to something more practical, like verbal reasoning, especially in, say, a university setting? The 2014 paper looks at that, right?
It does, and it makes the link very directly. It really underscores how central critical reading is. The paper estimates something like 85% of college learning involves reading.
Wow, 85%. So in that context, verbal reasoning really is largely about critical reading skills.
To a huge extent, yes. And the paper does a nice job contrasting expert critical readers with those who are less competent.
What are the key differences? What do the experts do?
Well, experts don't just decode the words on the page. They actively go beyond the literal meaning. They focus on the deeper structure, the author's purpose, the underlying argument.
They're reading between the lines.
Yeah, exactly. They make inferences, they connect what they're reading to what they already know, they actively monitor their own comprehension like, wait, did I understand that? And they shift their reading strategy based on the text and what they need to get out of it.
It sounds much more active and strategic, less passive.
It absolutely is.
Hmm.
And things like background knowledge and vocabulary are huge factors here. They provide the foundation. Good vocabulary, for example, allows for more efficient processing, what researchers sometimes call chunking information. It also reflects how much reading you've done before.
So knowledge builds on knowledge. The paper also outlined a set of cognitive operations for verbal reasoning, didn't it? More than just reading.
Yes, it proposed a framework of about 8 key operations important for higher education. Things like understanding, obviously, but also interpreting, evaluating, which connects directly back to Ennis, incorporating new information into your beliefs, even creating new understandings.
So it includes using the information too.
Right. Things like seeking and solving problems using the information, communicating your understanding, and even metacognition, monitoring your own thinking processes. It's a broad skill set.
That sounds incredibly complex to measure accurately.
Oh, it's a major challenge. What's a complex reasoning task for a beginner might be totally routine, almost automatic for an expert in that field.
Right.
So assessments, like the ones used for college admissions, often try to measure verbal reasoning primarily through critical reading tasks.
Because reading is so central, and maybe it's just more practical to test that way.
Partly practicality, yes, but also because critical reading is demonstrably crucial for academic success.
And how well do those tests actually predict how students will do? The paper addressed that, right? Predictive validity.
It did. The sources discuss how scores on these verbal reasoning tests correlate with outcomes like first-year college GPA. They find a moderate correlation, meaning the tests are useful indicators, especially when you combine them with other things, like high school grades. They add predictive value.
So helpful, but not the whole story.
Exactly. And a key finding they highlighted was that this predictive validity seems to hold up consistently across different groups. They studied men and women, various ethnic groups, students with and without disabilities, native and non-native English speakers.
That's important that the tests aren't inherently biased against one group in terms of their predictive power. But there was also a mention of unanticipated effects.
Yes, how the existence of the test can sometimes influence teaching and studying practices, maybe not always for the better.
How so?
Well, the example given was students focusing heavily on memorizing vocabulary definitions from flashcards because they think that's what the test wants.
Ah, teaching to the test, or studying to the test.
Right. When research actually suggests that reading widely and encountering words in different contexts is a much more effective way to build the kind of deep vocabulary knowledge needed for real comprehension and reasoning.
So the test might inadvertently encourage a less effective learning strategy?
It can happen, and sometimes assessment makers respond to this. The paper notes that some tests dropped certain question types, like analogies or antonyms, partly in response to research suggesting they might overemphasize rote memorization.
Interesting. It shows that assessment isn't just a passive measurement tool. It shapes the educational landscape itself.
Absolutely. It's a dynamic interaction,
Yeah.
a feedback loop.
Okay. So we've covered quite a journey here, from the early struggles just to define reasoning and find objective signs of it.
Through Ennis's detailed breakdown of critical thinking, as assessing statements, covering logic, evidence, assumptions, language, authority.
All the way to how these skills manifest as verbal reasoning in higher education, how we try to measure them, and even how measurement affects learning.
What really stands out across all these sources, I think, is that reasoning and critical thinking aren't simple, single abilities. They're complex, layered processes.
Absolutely essential processes for making sense of the world, for tackling problems, for engaging with information instead of just being overwhelmed by it.
And importantly, the research, especially when you look at expert performance or critical reading development, strongly suggests these are not just innate gifts you either have or don't.
Right. They seem to be skills that can be learned, practiced, developed, honed through effort and guidance.
It really requires an active effort to understand things deeply, to interpret carefully, to evaluate rigorously, and to consciously integrate new information with what you already know.
It's definitely not passive. Which, I suppose, leads us to a final thought to leave with you, the listener.
Okay.
Given this whole history, this ongoing debate and evolution in how experts themselves define and understand reasoning and critical thinking across different times and fields,
Wow.
what does that tell you about the real nature of these abilities? Is the quest for one single, perfect, unchanging definition maybe less important than the actual dynamic, ongoing process of trying to understand and improve how we think, how we judge, how we make sense of things in a world that keeps changing?
Maybe the core skill is actually that adaptability,
Yeah.
the continuous effort to refine our own thinking, rather than settling on a final definition, something to chew on.